I'd just like to welcome everyone here. Just a couple housekeeping things that I would like to have you do is if you're not speaking, please keep yourself muted because we sometimes get crazy background noise that isn't the best, and so let's keep ourselves muted. This is our third annual kickoff for March Media Madness. We started this 3 years ago and it keeps going, and Stefan will give us a little more history when we get into the his part of our presentation. But it's really exciting to still be doing this 3 years later and to have so many people coming for trainings so that we can do a good media outreach this March. I got the idea of doing this webinar when I did a EDF-led staff webinar on writing LTEs and op-eds a month or so ago, about 6 weeks ago, I think. And I was just really impressed. I've sat in on a lot of those workshops, and this was like one of the most helpful that I've done. And so I thought, gee, March Media Madness is coming up. You know, we want to do something to kick it off, and let's reach out to the presenters and say, you know, would you do something for Arizona? We're a great bunch of people. We're really active and we do a lot, and we'd love to have you. And Jared Carter and Michael Cronin reached out, said yes. And so I reached out to Stefan Sommer from Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance and professor at NAU, and he said yes. And so that's how this webinar evolved. We are just really, really excited to have Michael and Jared. I think, Jared, you're from Vermont, and Michael, I believe you're in Washington, D.C. Jared is on the staff of the law school in Vermont, and Michael is an EDF project manager for climate. And they'll tell you a little bit more about themselves, so you'll get to know them a little better. Let's go ahead without any more talking, and I'll turn it over to Michael, and he's going to share his screen, and we'll have some slides.
Thanks so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Right. Alrighty. So, hey everyone. Thanks, Hazel, for that introduction. My name is Michael Cronin. I'm a project manager for Environmental Defense Fund's Climate Corps program. And Climate Corps is a fellowship program where we match graduate students and recent graduate students with companies to complete sustainability projects for 10 to 12 week summer fellowship. And in my role, I help develop professional development opportunities for our alumni network and for our like-minded partners, including these trainings on how to focus on climate advocacy. So we've been doing, Jared and I have been doing trainings like this and have partnered to do trainings like this for 5 or 6 years now. But I also want to give Jared a chance to introduce himself as well. So Jared, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and great to see everybody. I am zooming in from snowy Vermont, where we're hopefully at the tail end of a blizzard. So if my internet's a little bit spotty, I apologize. It tends to happen when we get snowstorms. But really, really happy to be here. I was thrilled when Michael let me know that Hazel had reached out, and we were able to put the pieces together. It's been a while since I've been in Arizona, but I have fond memories of my time there, and certainly glad to be part of this workshop. As Hazel said, and Michael also said, I'm on the faculty at Vermont Law School. where I teach a host of different environmental law and advocacy courses, as well as First Amendment law. So sort of a smorgasbord of things, but primarily geared towards advocacy, of which, of course, traditional media and letters to the editor fits. So really thrilled to be here and pleasure to meet you all, and look forward to moving through the materials with you and having a conversation about it.
Thanks so much, Jared. Yeah, and tonight, we'll focus on how to write letters to the editor and op-eds that will help apply pressure on our nation's leaders to act on climate. And we'll also talk a little bit about submitting public comments to federal agencies. That's also a great way to get engaged right now. So let's get started. So first off, I think it's important to identify the why to ground us all, like why is it necessary to have this workshop right now? Because if you're familiar with what's been going on in the last couple of years, you may be asking yourself from a climate policy perspective, the advocacy work is done, right, Michael? I mean, we passed 3 major climate bills this past year or 2, and now the money will be spent. Why do we need to write letters to the editor and op-eds and submit public comments right now? And it's true, these bills were signed into law over the last couple of years. They have injected a ton of money into the US economy, north of $500 billion to catalyze our transition to a clean energy future. But our advocacy work is far from over. I'd say it's just entered into a new chapter. We as citizens need to do our part in ensuring that all of this money is spent equitably, efficiently, and we all know our communities best. I'm sure you all know Arizona best. And what Arizona needs, and we know how this money should be spent, and the government needs our input. This slide just goes into a little more detail about these laws and where we currently stand from a political standpoint. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, injects $62 billion into clean energy investments and much needed funding for clean energy, as well as things like America's water infrastructure, environmental cleanups, clean air protections. The CHIPS and Science Act, it's actually, most of it goes towards boosting domestic research and manufacturing for semiconductors and computer chips. But it also sets aside $67 billion in funding for advancing zero emissions technologies and improving climate science research. And finally, the big one, or the biggest one, was the Inflation Reduction Act, which represents the largest investment in climate in our nation's history, to the tune of $391 billion. And this includes funding for things like renewable energy tax credits. And then, projection-wise, moving forward at the federal level, the midterm elections last fall, as you know, yielded a divided Congress with a narrow Democrat majority in the Senate and then a narrow Republican majority in the House. What this means practically is we have divided government, and on the legislative, bill passing lawmaking side, things are likely to slow down a bit in the next couple of years, but this just means that the responsibilities now falls on the administrative side, on the federal agencies to implement the laws that have already been passed. So just some additional context here about bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA. According to the White House Office of Management and Budget, these 2 laws put us on track to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by about 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. And if implemented well and with our input, we could definitely achieve this. But even then, that's 10% short of the Paris commitments, as well as the Biden administration's goal to reduce emissions by 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. So where do we get the extra 10% of reductions? The 10% is going to come through additional rulemaking from the federal executive agencies. So all this funding that's been unlocked for climate spending will be allocated to agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and Department of Energy to prop up existing climate programs or create new climate programs or strengthen existing standards like pollution standards or create new standards. And some money will also be sent to the state and local agencies to implement programs. And now these agencies are and will be soliciting public comments. The public can provide input on how the money should be spent, how the program should be implemented. And submitting public comments, in addition to writing LTs and op-eds, is a great way for you to get engaged. This is just a little graphic I wanted to share quickly from the Public Comment Project, explaining how the process works at the federal level. So Congress, passes laws and directs authority to federal agencies to solve a particular problem. In this case, with the climate bills that have been passed, the responsibility falls on the Department of Energy, EPA, other agencies. And then the agency works with internal and external stakeholders to draft a regulation proposal or proposals. So draft proposals are submitted into the Federal Register, where comments are collected from the general public. And after comments are collected, the comment period ends and the agency revises the regulation based on comments. And then they publish the final rule, and then the laws get implemented. So this is a call to action slide, something you can do now. There's rules being considered by EPA that are open for public comment right now, and EPA needs your input. So this is a good chance for you to make your case to the Biden administration to strengthen pollution protections as much as possible. There was a methane rule being considered that closed for public comment just recently, that was proposing cutting methane emissions in oil and gas operations across the United States. And now there's a rule for public comment, and I heard one of you mention it before this meeting started, about stronger soot standards. So soot is a deadly and dangerous particle pollution produced by power plants, vehicle tailpipes, industrial sources. It increases risk of asthma, stroke, heart attack, cancer, causes a lot of deaths. And soot pollution standards have not been addressed for the last 10 years, despite it being a requirement to review on a periodic basis from the Clean Air Act. So it's definitely a big deal. We're revisiting these standards. So EPA has proposed tightening restrictions, but their draft proposal is not like as far as we want it to go. So because research suggests that standards could be even tighter and save more lives. So I'm sharing, I'd ask Hazel to share a link in the chat now, which provides a comment template, makes it easy for you to submit public comment to the EPA about the soot standards. And you can do that whenever you have the time. So what's the plan going forward? We all have to make our voice heard and get engaged so we can influence how this money is spent from these laws. We can do this by submitting public comment, as I've gone over, but we can also do this by applying public pressure through writing LTs and op-eds. And Jared's going to go over this in much more detail. And another thing that I think is important, in addition to the media engagement and the comments, is just thanking your legislators who voted for these climate bills, IRA, bipartisan infrastructure law. They want to hear from you that you supported their vote, and they want to hear that their constituents care about climate. So it's more likely for them in the future to continue voting the way we want them to on climate bills. So that's it for me, but I'm going to pass it along to Jared now to go more in detail about LTs and op-eds.
Thanks, Michael. And I think that's a great segue in because I want to just echo, I think there's a perspective when it comes to something like traditional media and letters to the editor, maybe not with you all, because I'm guessing you're here because you're advocates and you're engaged, but I think there's a perspective that this is old school and it doesn't really work. Nobody reads letters to the editor. And so I was really thrilled by this idea of March Media Madness, not only because I'm a huge basketball fan, but because I really believe and truthfully know that this stuff works. Traditional media, letters to the editor, op-eds, certainly public comment, if you feel comfortable doing that as well. But this stuff works. And the way that I know that is not any sort of social science study, although those are out there. It's because in the instances where I've had things published in my community, and I'm talking just the little local newspapers or newsletters for my neighborhood, people come up to me, people come talk to me at the grocery store, at the post office. People read these things, they pay attention at that community level. And it is just, as Michael said, not the time to go to sleep. We need those community conversations going on. Yes, we had this terrific success, historic success in Washington, D.C. in many respects. But now we can't fold up our beach chairs. I wish I was at the beach. I'm in freezing Vermont. But we can't fold up our beach chairs and go home, right? We really need people to be engaged, folks like yourselves, to be writing these letters, whether it's putting additional pressure on administrative agencies, state, federal government, local politicians, or just letting your neighbors know what's going on and what the opportunities are to get involved. It really is the time where it requires action, putting these things to good use. So I want to walk through some of the basics of effective letters to the editor. Perhaps some of you have already done these, and so maybe this is a bit of a refresher, but hopefully if you haven't, or you haven't done one in a while, it will inspire you to go out and do it, because it's such a powerful tool in getting the media to pay attention. So when I sit down to write a letter to the editor, there's some things I really want to consider before I start. And I want to walk through those, and then we'll talk about sort of the nuts and bolts of actually drafting. The first thing is what I'm going to say newsworthy, right? For better or worse, the way our media ecospace is set up is, whether it's local media, whether it's neighborhood newspapers, whether it's national newspapers, right? They want eyeballs, right? That's how it works. More eyeballs they get, the more ad revenue they get. And there's a whole nother conversation about that to be had. But the reality is, if you want to get your letter to the editor published, you got to think about what's your unique angle or frame. What's the story you can tell that's going to be newsworthy? And I think the idea of framing and the audience that you're targeting is really, really critical to that. But the idea of being newsworthy doesn't necessarily mean it has to be this huge, splashy issue, but being able to have a hook that draws in that letter to the editor, or whoever's going to be deciding on who's going to get published, is really, really important. So ask yourself, is what I'm going to say newsworthy? That's number one. Second, and this is related to newsworthiness, is it contemporary, right? Letters to the editor are going to be most likely published around things that are actually happening within that outlet's jurisdiction, if you will, within the community. And so you want to tailor your unique newsworthy angle to something that's happening, something that's current, something that's contemporary. It doesn't have to be yesterday, but something that people are thinking about and talking about. Again, that's what's going to increase your likelihood of getting something published. The difficulty, of course, with climate is, yes, the power of now is urgent, but it's a longer term thing. It's harder to connect to day-to-day events. But I urge you, if you're going to think about a letter to the editor in your community, try to make a connection to something that's happening, right? Increased storms, drought, temperature fluctuations, whatever it is, economic impacts. That's a really powerful tool. Try to bring something contemporary into that letter. It's going to up the likelihood that you're going to get published. It's the hook that's going to get you in the door, get your letter considered. So is it contemporary is number two. And then is it preempted? Of course, you're more likely to publish if somebody hasn't written the same thing the day before, right? So some coordination is important. I always go back to the outlet that I'm submitting to, and I go back a few weeks and look at previous letters to the editor if I don't just sort of follow them naturally, and make sure that nobody's already said this. And if they have, then come up with a unique hook, a unique angle. It doesn't mean you can't write about similar topics, but bring in your story that's going to make it unique and make it less likely that you're going to be preempted. Because if somebody's done it already, it's probably not going to be published. So check for preemption. This is my favorite one. And it's because it's I suppose a truism, right? Controversy sells. Now that may be good, bad, or otherwise, but it's reality, and media outlets want to sell. So how can you use that to your advantage? I think considering themes, considering controversy, right? Are there bad actors, if you will, that you can set your letter to the editor up against? I understand that's sometimes hard to do at the hyper community level, right? Because we're neighbors. So you want to be mindful of that. But if you can frame your letter to the editor so that it highlights a particular political, economic, environmental controversy that's going on, it's going to be more likely to be picked up by your local media outlet. And I'm a big believer, by the way, and I'll touch on this again a little later. I'm a big believer in, yes, we need to think nationally, we need to think globally when it comes to climate, but it really is, for letters to the editor, the most effective are going to be the ones that are hyper local, right? Your local newspaper, your local community newsletter. Maybe it's a publication, a hard print publication. Maybe it's an online outlet, but those are the ones people tend to read and listen to. And so don't, assume you've got to, and I don't know what the big newspaper is in Phoenix or Flagstaff or any of the other larger towns, Tucson and Arizona, but don't assume you have to hit the big one. And if you don't get it published in the big one, you must be doing something wrong. That hyper-local approach can be very, very effective as well. So controversy is an important thing to consider and try to highlight perhaps in your letter to the editor. And then themes, right? Storytelling. We all like a good story. You don't have a lot of time in a letter to the editor, right? We're talking about a few hundred words. Op-eds a little bit longer, but you want to think about a theme, right? And this might connect into controversy as well, but think about a theme that's going to allow you to tell the story the way you want it to be told, right? Victims and villains, good and evil, big corporation versus the people, big government versus the people. I don't know, whatever your theme is, common sense versus not common sense, right? Come up with a theme and work on framing your letter to the editor through that. It's going to make it more effective. And if you thought about that in advance, you're going to put yourself in a better position to get that thing published. So think about themes. All right. So those are some pre-letter to the editor homework, if you will, that I think you want to be thinking about before drafting. The nuts and bolts are fairly straightforward, but probably worth going through for a couple of minutes here. Number one, right? Identify your local media outlet, right? And figure out, how do you submit, right? These mostly all have websites. It's generally pretty easy. You're sending it to some email, but make sure you follow the instructions, right? If they say 250 words or less, you better hit that, or it's going to get tossed off the top, no matter how good your letter is. So you want to identify the local outlet. I like to think about audience there. So if I am, targeting a particular audience, I want certain people to see my letter. Well, I'm going to pick a local media outlet that I think is more likely to be one that target audience reads. And my target audience might be the mayor, it might be Senator so-and-so, or it might be my neighbors. But you want to think about that when you're looking at who is the right media outlet to submit this to. So that's number one. Number two, and this goes into, I think, the importance of personalization. You got to establish your connection and authority to comment. That doesn't mean you have to be, a PhD or have a doctorate in climate change and the law. It can be as simple as a member of this community, I'm concerned about what's going on, right? That's established your authority to comment on something that's impacting the community, and it's established your connection to whatever it is you're commenting on. So I think that's really, really important. Tell your story, write what you know. It's going to increase the likelihood of publication, and it's going to be more effective. And then that letter to the editor really needs to have a couple of key pieces. A very brief introduction, right? Some key facts and background information. And then I think having a call to action is always important in a letter to the editor. Even if it's, we should all tune in and pay attention to what's going on, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a call to action like you should vote or you should call your senator, or it doesn't have to be that specific. But if you get your letter to the editor in front of that many eyeballs, don't miss out on the opportunity to tell them to do something. So have a call to action, and then you're going to have to briefly conclude and reiterate that call to action. So they're short, sweet, and to the point. Those are the three pieces that are critical. Next slide. All right, so how do you pick that right outlet? Maybe you all already know what the right local outlet is for your letters to the editor. But I think, as I've already said, and I'll repeat, thinking really locally, A, it's going to increase your likelihood of publication, and B, I think impact, right? I've submitted multiple letters to the editors and op-eds to national newspapers. Very rarely have I ever been published. If I submit something to my neighborhood newsletter, it's guaranteed to be published and it's guaranteed to be read, both by my neighbors and probably by local officials and politicians. So think local, act local. Don't worry if your letter doesn't get published in the biggest media outlet in Arizona. And I've talked about this a little bit too, but how do I establish that connection and authority to comment? I think including a short bio, a lot of times publishers will put that in there. It's not a long bio, it's short, a sentence or two, right? Jared Carter is an environmental advocate at Vermont Law School, right? Just something to show that you have some connection to the issue. I think it's also worth trying to establish a relationship with the reader and the audience. And again, you have limited space, so it might be something as simple as, I've lived in this community for 17 years and I've never seen X, right? Whatever it is, but show that you have that relationship to the audience, to the reader, and to the issue. And then know the facts, right? Again, you don't have to be an expert, but some key data, right? Maybe a short anecdote, something that happened to you or happened to your neighbor as a result of whatever climate issue you're writing on, or environmental issue that you're writing on. A quote, right? Maybe a quote from you, a quote from a neighbor, a quote from a politician who said something, right? Again, setting it up so that it's persuasive. Yes, data, anecdotes, those are persuasive. Yes, showing your authority to comment, your connection to the community, that's persuasive. You got to have both. So I think a little bit of this is very, very helpful. All right, so a few additional tips. Number one, most of the time for letters to the editor, we're talking under 250 words. So you really got to get to the point. Op-eds can be a bit longer. 500 words, I think, is a good average. But of course, follow the instructions at whatever outlet you're posting or you're submitting to. Have a hook, right? We've touched on this a little bit already. Right? Reference something that was recently printed or something that recently happened, right? You're trying to establish relevance early and off the bat, right? The first couple of sentences, certainly the first paragraph. You really need to get to the point, okay? A letter to the editor is not a suspense novel. It's hitting us up front with what we need to know. And that's going to be important for increasing your likelihood of publication, and it's going to be important for its persuasiveness. And then think about what arguments, you might only get to make 1 or 2 points in a letter to the editor. So you really want to think about what are going to be the most persuasive to the audience I'm targeting, right? If I'm targeting city council members in my hometown of Burlington, Vermont, and I know there's 2 that are on the fence and they have a particular perspective. Maybe they're more interested in, economic and tax issues than they are in environmental issues. Well, I'm going to frame my letter to the editor through the lens of economics and taxes, right? Even if that's not what necessarily fires me up the most. You really want to think about what's going to be the argument that's going to work. And then make sure you provide your contact information. Usually this is pretty easy when you're submitting an email, but most of the time, if they're going to publish your letter, they're going to reach out to you first just to confirm that it was really you and make sure that you still want to do it. So if you don't give them contact information that you regularly check, right? Your email, your phone number, whatever it is, then you might miss that email or call. So make sure you include that as well.
Jared?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we have a document that will be coming out to all of you right after this finishes with specifics for all of for our major newspapers. How to submit a letter to the editor, op-ed, and what are the word numbers. I just have to say that our big newspapers, Arizona Republic, it's now 160 words. So that makes it really difficult to write 160 words that says what you need to say. So
yeah, that's the biggest challenge. That sounds like a great resource, Hazel. So definitely folks keep an eye out for that, because it is, the idea is to make this as easy as possible. 160 words, right? You got to be pretty precise. All right, so just very briefly, and then I'll wrap up, although I think we have an example to show you in a minute to sort of chat about op-ed versus letter to the editor. I think sometimes people use the terms interchangeably. They're actually not. They are different. As a general rule, an op-ed is written in response to an editorial, right? That was published in the outlet, right? Hence op-ed for opposition to editorial or opinion on editorial, depending on how you look at it. They tend to be a bit longer, so you get some more space. They also tend to be harder to get published. Not impossible, but op-eds are more likely to be published, by someone who's well known in the community or on that topic. I wouldn't let that dissuade you. Certainly, that's not a hard and fast rule, but just be aware as you're sort of weighing what makes the most sense for me and my time commitments, what's going to be most likely to be published. Maybe you have two versions. One's an op-ed version, one's a letter to the editor version. You try both, but they're fairly similar other than that. All right, so we've talked very briefly about some of the keys to effective letter to the editor drafting. We have an example here that I'd like to show, and then we'll do a pop quiz. I can't help myself, as a law professor, quizzes are something I love to do. So let's take just a couple of minutes, because I know time is short and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, to read through. This is a recent letter to the editor, or I suppose opinion piece that was published. So just take a look through it, see if anything jumps out at you, and then I'll have some real pointed questions, and we'll take roughly a minute and a half. So just quickly buzz through it, and I'll let everyone do that. All right. So I know that was pretty quick, but did anyone see a theme in there? And I'd love you, feel free to drop it in the chat, and maybe Hazel, if you see someone drop something in the chat, that's great, or unmute yourself to answer. Did anybody see a theme in that op-ed that jumped out at you? What do you think? See, in law school, I would do what I would call cold calling people and just call people's names out so that then they have to answer. But I won't do that here. But I certainly would love to get you all's thoughts. Any sort of thematic components to this that people saw, and if not, I'll offer my thoughts. Mitigation on methane reduction will help the economy. Yeah, thanks, Peggy. I think that's a big part of it. There was definitely an economic piece to this, right? It wasn't straight enviro, if you will. It definitely had a common sense and economic benefits theme to it. So I think that's right. And right, this is somewhat subjective. And Linda added jobs. I think that's consistent with what this person's trying to get across. So good. All right. A couple of other quick questions. Anything that jumped out at you in terms of, like, remember we talked about newsworthy and data from this that you thought was particularly effective? I think for me, I liked how they set this up so that it highlighted the disproportionate impact. Right. Also, I think Hazel, that's an excellent point with respect to West Virginia. But they had some good data. Like they didn't overdo it with data so that you were kind of overwhelmed and it was hard to follow. There's too much science and data and it made it kind of wonky and boring. They didn't do that, but they dropped, I think, some key facts in there that made it more likely that this would be published. And then one more quick question on the next slide. Call to action. Anybody see the call to action in here? Last paragraph, right? That's where the call to action would normally go. So this person got it published, didn't miss out on the chance to tell people to do something, right? Encourage your legislators to act. And I think that's a pretty standard sort of call to action. But I hope that's helpful. Maybe some of you have done these before and have played around with this a bit, but hopefully that's helpful. It really is important now for us to get engaged, to make our voices heard, as Michael said at the outset. There's a lot of different approaches you can take. It doesn't have to be, legislator vote this way. You can use a letter to the editor to thank a group of legislators for acting in a certain way, to create political cover for them, if you're so inclined. That can be helpful. And you can also use them to get your community educated about a particular issue. So it doesn't always have to be geared around, legislative politics, although that's a fairly traditional sort of letter to the editor instance. Lots of different ways to use them. They are effective. I'm really thrilled to be here and share this with you. Hopefully this was helpful. Well, I think have a little bit of time at the end for questions. But with that, I'll turn it over to Hazel and Stefan to take us home.
Thank you so much, Jared and Michael. This is wonderful. As I mentioned in the chat, we have a March Media Madness toolkit or media resource that we're going to send out that has a lot of Arizona media outlets and who to contact, the criteria for writing letters to the editor and op-ed, where to submit. And also I have given you a lot of the major reporters that report on this kind of thing. And I really want to encourage you to use your social media and post on their feeds some quotes from your letter to the editor or whatever you submit to build the interest around the issues you're concerned about. We're running a little bit behind time, so I want to make sure that we give Stefan a bunch of time. So Stefan, do you want to go ahead? This is
thank you, Hazel.
Father of March Media Madness. It was his brilliant idea.
Well, yeah, so the idea of March Media Madness evolved out of some organizational meetings we had here in Flagstaff, Arizona with the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story and kind of how we got our way into the local media. So hopefully this will be of interest and set some examples that maybe some other folks would like to follow. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Can everybody see the slide?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so as I mentioned, I'm with the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance. I serve on the board of directors and I'm recently retired from Northern Arizona University. My field is in ecology. And in my last semesters, I started teaching global sustainability, which got me into climate change. And then through NASCA, I had the opportunity to make a lot of public presentations about climate change because it is the critical topic of our time. The biggest, the most impactful, the one that will change is already changing all our lives. So we need to pay attention to this and we need to get the media's attention. So NASCA's mission is basically to engage people, inform them about climate change, and empower them to do something about it. And we do that in a wide variety of different ways. So these are some of those ways. We have a variety of different action teams. Action teams come and go over time. This is actually a slide from a few years ago. And one of the things that we got into during COVID was what are called shoe strikes. And we would, rather than gathering a whole bunch of people and spread the virus, we had people donate their shoes to let their shoes stand in for them at a protest. And in the end, we had over 750 pairs of shoes. And you can see we're laying them out here at City Hall. And each time we had a shoe strike, we would focus on a different theme: climate refugees or climate justice, as the case may be, emissions, whatever. It was always a different theme. On our very first shoe strike, we had great media coverage. So they sent their photographer. We got front page pictures, both on a Saturday and the Sunday, the next day. And then we did these every month, third Saturday of every month. They started just ignoring our press releases. So we only got covered the first time. And after that, they just thought, well, we've been there, we've done that. This is not news. So that got us kind of frustrated. And we started talking more and more about how do we get the media involved. And we continued to do new themes every time, but it also made us pay attention to, were they covering climate change at all in our local newspaper? And yes, there was some coverage, but it's minimal, given that this is a global crisis with tens of thousands and tens of millions of people being affected in different ways in different parts of the globe all the time, including the way the Flagstaff community is affected. We thought it should be a headline every day. And so we came up with March Media Madness. And the idea is to get folks to get the media's attention. So our shoe strikes, they're COVID safe. We would put out these shoes. We would get people involved in one way or another. Here's an example of a flyer that we did for an Earth Day shoe strike. But for our March Media Madness, we decided that we would try to get everybody to write a letter every day, letter to the editor every day to the Daily Sun. And this went well beyond Flagstaff. So there were folks in many parts of the state here and in many other parts of the country and in other countries. So it went to Canada, it went to Australia, it went to Europe, it went to Africa, and it went to Southeast Asia. So people all over the world were doing these letter to the editor campaigns to try to get the media to publish more about this crisis. And so I don't know about the details of many of those campaigns, but I can tell you a little bit about the details of ours. So what we decided, we would write letters to the editor every day. And if they published them all and started publishing more about climate, then we would have our shoe strike protest at the end of the month at their headquarters, and it would be a thank you protest. If they didn't publish any of them, it was going to be a mad as hell protest. And if it was somewhere in between, it would be somewhere in between protests. And really, that's what it was. They published most of our letters, but they didn't really change their overall coverage of climate change issues. So for over a year, we had had our press releases for these shoe strikes ignored by the Daily Sun. We always sent them out on the Wednesday evening before our Saturday protest. And on the Thursday morning, following the release of this particular flyer and the associated press release, I got a call from our newspaper's managing editor, Chris Etling. And he says, why are you targeting us? We're not the bad guys here. Well, you're not doing a good enough job in covering this climate crisis. And by the end of the conversation, he had offered for us to write a monthly column for the Daily Sun. We decided to call it Spotlight on Climate. and it's been running ever since. So in this case, what could have turned into an angry conversation ended up helping both us and him. He recognized that because there are so many NASCA members, so many folks concerned about climate change, that was a good topic for him to cover. That kind of sunk through during that conversation. And he saw the importance of having a column, and it helped us to get our message out. So we came up with this. The banner here shows basically the image we used for March Media Madness. This is a NASCA member who's not in Flagstaff. This is Steve Schliebs, who's down in Sedona, and he's protesting in front of his local newspaper. But he's got the basic message that we want to get across to media. We want to somehow get through their thick layers of decision-making to decide to put the climate crisis as their primary headline every day or as often as possible. So this was some of our training material that we would send out to folks. And if anybody wants copies of these older training documents, I'm happy to share them with you. I have a lot of details on how to approach this kind of thing, how to get people actively involved. One of the slogans that came out of this, again, in one of our NASCA organizational meetings, the slogan, "A letter a day keeps the media awake." So, I think most people probably did not write a letter every day, but it gave them a goal. It gave them a way of thinking about this. And we had lots of people writing letters to the editor. So in any case, that's how Spotlight on Climate came into being. So at the end of the month, we had our shoe strike at the Daily Sun headquarters. And you can see usually we laid them out in a big visible matrix, but in this case, we had them walking around the corner, about 3 blocks up to the front entrance of the Daily Sun. And again, we had relatively small numbers of people because of COVID. We do a lot of street theater associated with these protests. And so we had Julian Assange at this particular protest because he's a figurehead for free speech and protest. So we pulled out all the stops as we could. We did not get great media coverage of the event, but we did get some. So they came out of the building, asked us a few questions, snapped a few pictures, and we got in the paper, as you see here. We also had various folks, including myself, read our letters to the editor that got published, and these were recorded and posted. Here's Dee Hoagland, one of our longtime community members. And the Spotlights on Climate ended up looking like this. A lot of our focus in Spotlight on Climate is how to get the scientific understanding of climate change across. And the limit on this particular column is 700 words. So that gives us a little bit more than a letter to the editor, but it's still challenging to get the science across in an understandable way. And so there are a lot of things we have to focus on if we want trying to reach the person who doesn't necessarily think about climate change every day, who may even be a climate denier or have doubts about the data of climate change. And how do you reach and engage those folks? This is the first one that came out, Spotlight on Climate, What Do We Know About Climate Change? And it basically pointed out that scientists in Flagstaff had been doing research related to climate change since the late 1800s. So we made it locally relevant. We had another one that came out months later, Species Are Dying in Their Native Habitats, and that was based on the research of another NAU faculty member and the occurrence of a major die-off of junipers just north of our mountain here. Junipers are tough as nails, and if they're dying in their native habitat because of climate change related drought, things are bad, and we made that point. Okay, so basically, if you're trying to get a message across to an audience, you've got to know who you're talking to and then write to them in some way. People, in order to take in new information, people need to make meaning of what you're telling them, meaning that you have to connect to something that's already in their thinking process and then build from there. You can't just start with big 5-cylinder words and lots of new concepts. You've got to start with what they know and then build from there. Use everyday language. Use issues of local concern. So these are some of the things that we've used to engage folks in Northern Arizona. And we've got lots of issues of local concern. We've got major increase in the rate and intensity of wildfire. And we live in a forest, so this is a big thing. And we have had many recent fires that have burned people's homes and barns and landscapes. And then the flooding that comes after a landscape is denuded by fire. So we've used those issues. We've focused always on current issues of the moment. Either it's a news item or we're talking about mosquitoes in July when people are thinking about mosquitoes and how does climate change affect the density of mosquitoes. So we try to tie into what's going on in people's thinking at that time. Many of the writers for these spotlight columns have made it personal. They talk about their own experiences in a way that also invites others to share those feelings. And it's important too, particularly when we're talking about something as overwhelming as climate change, to provide hope. So some of our columns have been entirely about what we can do and what chances we have of making it through climate change. And others have just had, even though they're talking about all the bad outcomes of climate change, they end with a message of hope and here's what you can do. So provide actions that people can get involved in so they don't just feel frustrated and worried that the world is going to end, but feel like this is a really important topic and here's something that I can do about it. And sometimes you can use emotions to grab people, as this image here of a polar bear starving to death because it's lost its hunting grounds, because there's no more ice in the Arctic. And for us, since we're often trying to communicate about people's misunderstandings of climate change, we make a point of addressing those misunderstandings and helping them to see through them. Here's just some quick examples. And this is the very first one, actually. What do we know about climate change? So I started with, there are some of us who are unsure about climate change. Is it happening? Is it natural? Is it caused by us? What will happen, and so forth. So we addressed some of the common questions that people have, particularly folks who are in doubt or who are in denial of climate change. How long have we known? So we tried to we opened up with scientists in Flagstaff have been working on climate change research since the late 1800s, and we've known about climate change since the greenhouse effect was first proposed by Joseph Fourier in 1824. So we wanted to point out to folks, this is not just recent science. This is something we've known about for a long time. Wildfire. In this one, I opened up with, it's easier to start a fire with dry wood, right? So, that's a fairly basic statement, but it's something that everybody knows. So we could start with what's in people's thinking and then build to a greater understanding from there. Here we had Daryl Kaufman, who is one of the IPCC authors and works in the geosciences at NAU, talking about his own experiences and how recent warming is different than the warming over the past 20 million years. Lots of themes. So this one, again, this is the one that came out in July when people had buzzing mosquitoes every time they went out their front door. And for us in Flagstaff, when I first moved here, just 20 years ago, we didn't have mosquitoes. We did not, there were mosquitoes here, but you just didn't experience them. The kind of mosquitoes we had were not the rabid human-seeking mosquitoes that we now have. So the whole mosquito experience is something that's come on newly in Northern Arizona and in ways people have not experienced before. So this just came out in January. So we've been having a series of unusually cold time periods with lots of snow, which is kind of crazy here. And as I'm looking out my window right now, it is snowing, and we're supposed to get another between 6 and 12 inches tonight. So people have snow on their minds. Our streets are all lined with mounds of snow that are 10, 12 feet high. So climate extremes was a good topic to talk about in this context of what's on people's minds at the moment. And, you know, we're talking about all these new terms that are suddenly forefront in our vocabulary, like bomb cyclone, atmospheric river, polar vortex, mega drought, and others that have been in our vocabulary for a little bit of time, but were not commonly used. And then, you know, we had a professor who studies about wind energy, write about what the opportunities are for beginning to reduce our emissions and beginning to solve the problem of climate change. And why do we do all this? Because we want to keep our natural habitats beautiful, healthy, and help them to continue to support our lives. So I think you all are probably also equally interested in nature. And if you forget everything else, forget all the data, whatever, remember your connection to nature and write about the importance of preserving nature the way it has been in the past. Whatever your particular orientation is, whatever story you have to share with others, that's the story to write about in your letters to the editor. Use that as the theme. And if you would like to get involved with NASGA, we are always looking for more folks to help us to fill out our climate action teams and do the many different things that we're doing to grab the attention of the general public so that we can put pressure on our city managers, our city council members. So, and even if you're not in Northern Arizona, we always need digital help. We can use help in so many different ways. Please contact us and please get involved. And if you're already involved in some other organization elsewhere, please get as active as you possibly can. So I'm encouraging everybody to be as active as they possibly can because our situation is getting desperate. All right, well, thank you all very much and happy to answer any questions if anybody has them. And I'm sure that Michael and Jared would be happy to answer any questions from their presentation as well. So I think I'll give it back to Hazel.
Thank you so much, Stefan and Jared and Michael. I just want to make sure that every single one of you know that you've got help here. We can help you massage your letters to the editor or op-eds or any other kinds of letters to your legislature or whatever if you need help. But let's take action. Let's flood our media's inboxes, their op-eds, their letters to the editor. Let's make sure that we reach out on social media and use the Twitter handles of our reporters. When I get you the resource guide is going to have a lot of reporters with their names and their email addresses and their Twitter and Facebook handles. use that @ sign a lot and include them on social media that you put out. It's really, really, really important piece. But let's make this the best March Media Madness ever. I think we had something like 60 LTEs the first year, and I'm thinking that we were in 70 and 80 from all of the groups across the state. Last time we got some really great press as well, and this is an opportunity to just blast it away. I mean, what we find is that after every time we do a March Media Madness, we continue to get a lot of great media. You know, the Spotlight on Climate is a really good example, but there's been a lot of other good media. We get to know reporters and they call us when something happens that they think that we might know something about. So there's these relationships that are absolutely critical. So I know we're already at 5:35. I definitely will try to get the recording out within the next 24 hours. Hopefully I did it right. I had some problems in the past, but I think I got it right. And we will stay on for a few minutes if you're interested in asking any questions or have any discussion. And again, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Questions. We didn't answer everything, I'm sure.
Anybody have questions?
Yes, I do. I'm really wordy and I need help. What do you suggest on how to get my my wording down? Are there books or something? I need help with that.
Well, it's what we all face. How do you communicate effectively? And, you know, I think it's just a matter of feel. If you're writing about what you are passionate about, write a draft. If you're writing for the public, the more eyes you can get on it before you submit it, the better, because each different person that you ask for help in editing your piece will have a different perspective. And that means what you end up with will be designed to reach as many people as possible. So if you have friends, write a draft, run the draft by them, let them make comments, refine it, send it to another friend. And you know, if you've got friends who are expert writers, that's great. That's even better. If you want to send me a copy, I'm happy to take a look at things.
Thank you.
I also am happy to look at it. I have the same problem with being too wordy, and that's one of the things that I think we all struggle with. And it's getting, you know, your small newspapers are often willing to publish longer articles. I'm trying to think, there's one newspaper in Glendale that I've published in a couple times, and they will do, you know, longer than couple hundred words, usually 400 or 500 words. So you might want to, your first one, try to leave it a little longer and reach out. We'll help you target it to get it to a local newspaper for the first time, so you get a few under your belt. But it, you know, I think we all struggle with those word counts, and they don't give you any kind of leeway on, especially the Arizona Republic is the worst. You know, literally, if you have one extra space in there, sometimes it'll keep it from being going through. So you have to be really careful and do your word count carefully. And they do count spaces. I think it's 160 words, but it's also 1,200 characters, and that includes spaces. So if you use a lot of really long words, it counts up fast. Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, Mary, I can help you. I'll put my email address in the chat box.
Oh, good. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Any more questions?
I have a question for you, Hazel. I'm in Phoenix, we're in Phoenix. What kind of local newspapers are there in Phoenix? Is there, that's what I'm thinking, other than the Republic.
Well, there's, of course, Capital Times, but also there's an online newspaper called Copper Courier. That is a good one. I've had a couple letters to the editor published there. I'm going to set aside time at the Friday Arizona Climate Action Coalition, and everyone will get an invite. That we'll talk a little bit more about the whole media context and how to use them, but also how to find the local newspapers.
Okay.
Sometimes it's just by accident. Like I found a really Arizona Public News, which is an online newspaper, but they basically reach out, they record sound bites, and they reach out to local radio stations, which is just had an article published, and it's been going out to radio stations this week. So there's a lot of little ins and outs, and this month during the coalition meetings, we'll set aside time every week to talk about some of those resources that we can use that will allow our message to get out wide and clear.
Okay.
Jerry, do you have your hand up?
I don't have my hand up, no.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much for everyone coming. I will be getting the recording out, and I hope you will share it. And please join us on Friday, and we will make sure that we continue to discuss these ideas and help each other be successful in making our voices heard in ways that we've never done in Arizona. Thank you again so much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank